The bunker business was printing money. It basically created an entire cast of seller entrepreneurs. It reached the point where, in September 1961, Life magazine ran an issue in which U.S. President John F. Kennedy himself promoted personal shelters from a company called Lice. Later, when the Cold War was over, that golden bunker rush would be remembered with a smirk. Like, sure, everyone got jittery and sharp operators decided to monetize the fear. Happens to the best of us. But later on, once Cold War archives began to open up, it stopped being funny. You've got unthinkable plans, a joint US-UK concept for pushing into the USSR, only declassified in 1998. And you've got Operation Dropshot, proposing strikes on the Soviet Union with roughly 300 nuclear warheads. And of course, there were the 2015 declassified European target lists for atomic attacks, which made a ton of noise. And for the cherry on top, CIA programs like MK-Ultra, NORS, and Getrix, plus Flutgrot and other efforts on the KGB side. Bottom line, in the Cold War's backyard, both sides were very actively drafting ways to erase one another. Nuclear, chemical, biological, you name it. So it's hard to claim people were buying bunkers for no real reason. Some of the most insane theories people threw around back then turned out, decades later, to be very real and fully declassified projects. And today, we're talking about one of those. This one is Project 119, the secret U.S. plan to drop a nuclear blast on the moon. Not as outright lethal as many others, but easily one of the most vivid and bizarre projects ever pulled out of that era's files. And that still doesn't stop the U.S. government from officially denying it ever had anything to do with it. Hi everyone, this is Future Digest. Smash like, subscribe, and let's roll. The story begins in 1949. The Armor Research Foundation in Illinois was working on the hottest topic of the moment, figuring out what nuclear explosions do to the environment. Because in the early days, almost nobody truly understood radiation danger or the long-tail consequences of atomic tests. We even have a video on the channel about how artifacts on Codex film reels ended up exposing U.S. Army nuclear testing. And in total, official U.S. public health figures counted 690,000 deaths from 1951 to 1973 that were, one way or another, tied to atomic testing. Sometimes fallout drifted in on the wind, sometimes something detonated too close to where people lived. So yeah, studying what bombs do to nature eventually led to restrictions and then outright bans on nuclear weapons tests. And closer to the early 60s, in 1958, once they'd basically mapped the damage on Earth, that same ARF decided to go one step further and ask the exact question every self-respecting boy from 8 to 80 has asked. What if you set off an atomic bomb on the moon? On the team analyzing the consequences was a young and already legendary Carl Sagan, which tells you the level of brain power involved. To Sagan's credit, he was focused on the science, not the spectacle, because at the time, a nuclear blast in space looked like a potentially solid kick for a spacecraft headed to something like Mars. A lot of scientists were openly thinking about whether you could harness explosions for space travel. But the government was interested in a different angle, the patriotic one. On October 4, 1957, the USSR launched the first satellite and basically seized the space race crown. In the United States, the next decade was a repeating pattern of playing catch-up, and the public mood slid into panic. So a neat little solution appeared. Punch the moon with a nuke, blast American rock, and yell, "Fuck yeah, America!" One of the names orbiting that idea was Edward Teller, the father of the thermonuclear bomb, familiar to many from Oppenheimer. He, too, put down in writing that he wanted hard scientific data from a detonation under low gravity and in a vacuum. The program kept stalling out, and then, pure coincidence handed it a boost. An anonymous leak hit U.S. newspapers claiming the USSR was planning for the 1957 anniversary of the October Revolution to celebrate by nuking the moon. The timing was conveniently theatrical. November 7th was not only a major Soviet holiday, it also lined up with a lunar eclipse. So Washington started playing offense. The thermonuclear idea got tossed almost immediately. At that point, spaceflight was so early that even Gagarin hadn't gone up yet, and the US didn't physically have a launcher capable of hauling that kind of yield. so they looked smaller, a compact W-25 warhead, roughly 1.5 kilotons, about 15 times weaker than the bombs used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Leonard Reifel, the group's scientific lead, believed the concept could be technically achievable by 1959. And now we get to the real hook. What actually happens when you detonate an atomic device on the moon? More specifically, the only thing everybody truly cared about was whether you could see it from Earth, because if you can't, then the stunt has no point. That exact question landed on the desk of a young Carl Sagan. Both sides, in theory, aimed for a detonation near the terminator, that thin boundary line separating the moon's day side from its night side. But the math came back fast. The flash of the blast itself wouldn't be visible from Earth, no matter how perfectly you picked the location. To get a naked-eye star-on-the-moon effect, you'd need on the order of 50 megatons, preferably closer to 100, and even then it would only sparkle for a couple of seconds, like a tiny new star igniting on the lunar surface. The problem is, Tsar Bomba was only about 58 megatons, and its parachutes alone weighed around 800 kilograms. Sending that kind of monster into space is not just hard, it's basically unrealistic even for modern rocketry. And a W-25, even at a best-case 1.7 kilotons, would never read as a star in any version of the story. But the devil is always hiding in the details. The moon's surface is a loose silicate mix with traces of water and rocky material, and the moon has essentially no gravity, which means the blast would do two key things. First, it would melt and vitrify material into glass, and second, it would kick those particles up to the kind of speed you need to fling them into space. With no gravity to hold them down, that part becomes disturbingly easy. The outcome? A gigantic plume of dust and glass above the blast site, and once sunlight hits it, it starts reflecting in every direction. On paper, that creates a genuinely beautiful light show for people on Earth, something you might actually notice even with a small device like that. And if you did the same trick with a Tsar Bomba class yield, the moon could light up like something closer to the Orion Nebula, which would be an instant prestige injection for the US, both for domestic nerves and for foreign audiences. They would also, obviously, want to do it again, and the moon would quickly turn into a target range, with knock-on effects that not only Sagan but even modern researchers don't claim they can forecast with confidence. One thing is certain, with no lunar atmosphere, heat rejection is awful. That's a headache not only for bombs, but even for harmless telescopes, because beyond everything else, you have to keep pumping them with liquid nitrogen, and they die not from broken parts, but from running out of coolant. A nuclear device would lean into that same weakness. It wouldn't form a classic fireball and climb into a mushroom cloud the way it does on Earth. On the moon, it would bloom outward as a dome, expanding and expanding until the energy simply bleeds away. The upside is no classic devastating shockwave. The downside is a much larger footprint, wider area melting into glass, more terrain disruption, and a far bigger lift of regolith into the air that the moon doesn't even have. So what are you supposed to do if, inside that thrown-up lunar soil, there's a piece of metal tough enough to punch through Earth's atmosphere and crash down onto the surface? Because some of what the moon blasts into space will, thanks to gravity, be pulled toward Earth. Dust and tiny stones are fine, but bigger chunks can be dangerous. And the more times you blow things up on the moon, the higher the odds that something eventually falls onto our planet. Or the worst-case version, the rocket carrying the nuclear warhead falls back down. That became one of the biggest reasons both the American plan and the Soviet plan were scrapped. In the USSR, it went under the name E4, and, predictably, it was laid out in 4 stages, first reaching the lunar surface, then E2 and E3, flybys and photos of the far side, and finally E4, the same destination as the US idea, a nuclear strike. The catch is that the earliest references to that Soviet project show up in 1958, which makes those 1957 US newspaper rumors about a Soviet lunar nuke look like straight-up fiction. Either way, researchers on both opposing sides landed on the same verdict. The chance of losing a nuclear warhead during a failed launch was just too huge. And since, even then, lunar settlement looked like an eventually inevitable thing, poisoning the moon with radioactive waste in that context felt wildly counterproductive. So both the US and the USSR picked a different route to patriotism and prestige, the lunar landing, and they started preparing that more seriously than any nuclear bombardment stunt. Still, the nuclear thoughts didn't fully disappear until 1967. Hardtack I, Argus, Dominic, and other tests weren't exactly moon nukes, but they did quietly probe what nuclear blasts do at extreme altitudes, basically one step away from space, and that matters if you're thinking about disabling satellites and other spacecraft. Only after the Outer Space Treaty was signed did the door finally slam shut. Not only were nuclear tests on the moon banned, but even studying the outcomes, even hypothetical ones, became forbidden. The idea surfaced again later anyway. In 1969, Apollo program staffer Gary Latham suggested detonating a small nuclear device on the moon, this time for a genuinely scientific reason, to study lunar seismology and what the moon looks like on the inside. And, like it usually goes, even a purely scientific mission got killed because of the heavy military shadow that had already welded the moon to nuclear weapons in people's minds. Still, the moon is much smaller than Earth, and if you shook it properly, you could measure how fast the tremors race to the far side and calculate what it's made of, in what ratios, and, sure, whether there are aliens inside watching us. That's basically how the moon is studied today, with one key difference. Instead of manufactured blasts, we have to wait a long time for natural tremors like meteorite impacts. Only 40 years after Project A119 was officially shut down did details about it finally leak online. And once again, it proved the same point. The Cold War was the kind of era where the most ridiculous sci-fi concepts could genuinely be put on a real blueprint. If you enjoyed the episode, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones, and drop your ideas for future topics in the comments. The next video is already on the way. See ya!